Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm your host, Dmitri Alperovitch, and this is a podcast where we go deep behind the headlines to analyze the pressing geopolitical issues of the day. Today, I'm pleased to introduce a great returning guest, Justin Bronk, who is a senior research fellow on air power and technology at the RUSI think tank and a professor at the Royal Norwegian Air Force Academy. Justin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dmitri.
Great. Well, the reason I wanted to have you on now is because you have just published a very interesting and quite provocative piece at RUSI that is titled, NATO Should Not Replace Traditional Firepower with Drones. So dive in and tell us what is the premise of the article and what is the main argument you're trying to push across?
So the main premise is essentially based on a slightly alarming number of discussions that I and a lot of colleagues, I think, have had over the past year and a half, 2 years in a lot of NATO forces and HQs, as well as policy spaces. And there's a lot of public discourse on this stuff, where essentially people who have quite a lot of power in many cases seem to be remarkably convinced that loads and loads of small drones and one-way attack effectors, so propeller-powered cruise missiles, but people call them drones, are essentially going to replace traditional artillery, traditional aircraft, cruise missiles, all of these so-called traditional or legacy capabilities. And they usually cite the fact that in Ukraine, up until for quite a while now, the leading cause of attrition against Russian personnel and vehicles is FPV type and UAVs, FPV drones.
The latest numbers, I believe, are over 70% of the casualties on the Russian side are due to the FPVs.
Yeah. And interestingly, I think last month was actually the first month in which the majority of Ukrainian casualties, by a small margin, came from Russian FPVs. That's not because the Russians use fewer FPVs, far from it. They actually use a lot more than the Ukrainians do. It's just that Russia has a lot more artillery, essentially. And so, because of how genuinely critical and important those capabilities are and those millions of FPVs are to the way that the fighting is unfolding in Ukraine and the way that they have replaced a lot of traditional, at least partially replaced a lot of traditional firepower means for the Ukrainian armed forces and increasingly for the Russian forces in some cases, there's a view that this is sort of inevitable, the drift of warfare, and that in order to be modern and cutting edge, as NATO looks, particularly European NATO members, look to rebuild their militaries to deter fairly proximate Russian threat of wider aggression in the coming years, that we essentially have to go the same way or should go the same way. I find this pretty alarming as a set of dominant narratives, which, it should be said, are generally not held by specialists. If you talk to a lot of specialists, whether it's FPV specialists and operators themselves, whether it's drone developers themselves, whether it's artillerymen, tankers, aircrew, very few of them think that drones are going to replace those capabilities. Most of them will say, well, it's not an either or, it's an and. These are useful complementary capabilities. But that's not what you hear in the policy space, where people almost by definition can't be specialists most of the time. And so it's a little bit worrying, firstly, because this increasing overdependence on UAVs by Ukrainian forces in many areas is not something that has happened to them by choice. It has happened to them because they have just had to go that way out of necessity, because they haven't been able to secure enough artillery barrels, enough artillery ammunition, enough anti-tank guided missiles, enough of all these exquisite capabilities which the West traditionally relies on. And so as the fighting has gone on and they have expended and lost more and more people, equipment, ammunition, systems, they have had to compensate more and more with increased UAV production, as have Russian forces. And for a while, it's been enormously helpful, and it is now critical for Ukrainian forces and for Russian forces. But firstly, it should be understood that there's a lot of context dependency in the way that FPVs tend to attrit things as opposed to ATGMs. So first and foremost, Russian forces in Ukraine are still, although to a slightly lesser degree these days, have long been constrained in terms of their ability to maneuver quickly towards Ukrainian lines en masse by large amounts of minefields, and by the fact that with lots and lots of UAV and also other forms of ISR, any concentration of forces tends to attract a lot of artillery very quickly. And in the deep, Russian forces have had to forego what they used to do, which is massing gun lines essentially and piling up ammunition and just blasting their way through strong points, which was for a while giving them a faster rate of being able to push through key areas, particularly in the Donbass, because of quite traditional things: Gimlers, ATACMS, Storm Shadow for command posts and things in the deep. Similarly for factories and air bases with Ukraine's long-range drone strikes. So this is a force that is having to fight dispersed and already has thick minefields and a well-defended front line with fortifications to get to. In that context, FPVs en masse are very effective.
And also, by the way, critically, it doesn't have air superiority, right?
Right, and neither side can get air superiority at the moment, thank goodness, because the Russians are probably the only side that could exploit it if they could get it, and that's still a risk. But essentially, in that context, what FPVs give both Ukraine and Russia is an ability to constantly inflict attrition on personnel and on vehicles, even though it is relatively inefficient in terms of the numbers of FPVs that are used versus the number of actual kills or incapacitations. The fact that you can produce these things by the million means that they are a critical weapon for inflicting that low-level attrition, but constantly across a wide frontage, which obviously adds up. First and foremost, that's not the way that NATO forces would want to fight, nor the sort of campaign that we would be able to fight necessarily. It's certainly not something that our publics are prepared for, outside of arguably Poland and Finland. In terms of a relatively attritional, positionally based large land force versus large land force fight, that's not what we design forces to do. But secondly, again, it's a critical component to why FPVs are effective in that scenario is that Russian forces up to now have not been able to mass and use maneuver and heavy firepower because of the other traditional systems that are in the mix. And so the traditional response to this is to go, well, yeah, but it's both. NATO needs to do both. Sorry, there are a finite number of people, there is a finite amount of money, there is a finite amount of industrial capacity, and there's a finite amount of political capital. There need to be prioritization decisions. And so, in addition, one of the arguments that I wanted to bring to the fore for European countries specifically, not Ukraine, but European countries in NATO that are looking to deter future Russian aggression, they are now faced with trying to build up forces against a Russian army that is increasingly expert at countering UAVs. Because while Ukraine has been forced to go down this route of betting more and more and more heavily on UAVs for a whole host of capabilities, the decreasing amounts of artillery, ATGMs, and other things that the Ukrainian armed forces are able to rely on has meant that Russia has been able to put more and more focus into countering Ukrainian UAV use. And the Russians are now really pretty good at it. It's not to say that FPVs and one-way attack systems are useless by any means. They're extremely important and they're critical to Ukraine's defense. But Ukraine is, along with Russia, globally a leader in developing and using UAS, and it is still not providing any decisive advantage. It's allowing them to hold the line, but Russia is still grinding forward. And so for NATO forces looking at how to counter Russian aggression, I just don't think that trying to copy the Ukrainian approach, but inherently more slowly, with less urgency, with a much greater set of regulatory restraints, without the understanding of how to embed this stuff at all levels of your armed forces that the Ukrainians already have, as do the Russians, and against a Russian force that is not only already very good at counter-UAS, but is increasingly getting better and better at counter-UAS because it's increasingly their main problem set. I just don't think that's a sensible thing to do, especially since we have many, many more options than the Ukrainians have, which is by no means the Ukrainians' fault. The Ukrainians would love to have the tools that we have, I'm sure. They would love to have the sort of air power that Europe has latently that we haven't really put in the work and the acquisition to put the enablers and the munition stocks in place for. But yeah, essentially, I hear a lot of people say drones will bring transformative lethality to, let's say, the British Army, the Dutch Army, the German Bundeswehr. And what it essentially boils down to is claiming that we reckon that by producing thousands, tens of thousands, at best hundreds of thousands of drones, much more expensively, much slower, and without any of the experience the Ukrainians have, we will somehow gain transformative lethality against a Russian army in 2 to 3 years' time, who will be that much better at countering UAVs compared to Ukraine, which is going to produce, 4.5 million drones this year, and is still being pushed back despite 3 years of optimization and combat experience. It's illogical.
There's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, part of the attraction of drones is that usually they're cheaper, but also you don't potentially risk the lives of personnel. So there's a lot of political benefits to using drones versus relying on manned systems. But let me dive into a little bit more detail because I'm trying to understand still the core of your argument. Are you arguing specifically against reliance on these personnel-launched FPV drones, or all sorts of drones, whether it's surface-based maritime drones, underwater drones, ground-based vehicles that are being deployed in Ukraine for various scenarios, like resupply and medevac and so forth. Long-range drones, which are, as we've discussed on this podcast before with you, are resembling cruise missiles. Are you saying all of those things we should reduce our reliance on, or specifically just the FPV personnel launch drones?
It's a great question. I mean, it's the question. So first and foremost, I am certainly not saying that NATO forces shouldn't invest in uncrewed systems. Absolutely not. Well, we absolutely need to be investing in uncrewed systems. It's not the argument. What I'm specifically trying to argue against is the proposition that as European forces try to rebuild lethality, essentially, against Russian forces, that we should bet on large-scale development and manufacture of small UAVs, FPV types and loitering munition types, as the primary means of increasing lethality against Russian forces in any future clash. That is the proposition that I am taking issue with, because I think, well, 4 reasons. 1, the Russians are very, very good at countering UAVs, so majoring in UAVs as your core form of lethality is probably not a very good idea. 2, the Russians are focused on countering UAVs now as their main problem set in a way that they have not been for most of the last 3.5 years, because the Ukrainians are being forced to depend so heavily on them. 3, because fundamentally it's actually physics-wise and technology-wise quite easy to counter lots of UAVs if that's your primary threat. It's really difficult to counter lots of UAVs if you have a force structure that is set up to deal with traditional threats. It's actually quite easy to counter them from a technical and physics-based point of view, because they move relatively slowly. They're relatively easy to detect with a whole host of systems, from acoustics through radars if you have the MCON space to do it. And they're relatively easy to shoot down if you have spec'd basically gyro-stabilized weapons with airburst shells and laser rangefinders and decent optics, coupled to things like acoustic detect. Compared to a lot of the physics problems for which we have real-world, combat-proven, extremely reliable systems. So, for example, the physics problem that is intercepting a maneuvering exo or indo-atmospheric ballistic missile with penetration aids with a hit-to-kill missile. Like, that as a physics problem is unbelievably challenging, and as a military problem to field that as a reliable soldier-proof system is extraordinary. Patriot and THAAD do that all the time. That's something that we can do. Compared to those sorts of problems that militaries have mastered, frankly, and we don't have enough of it, but we know how to do it. The problem set of, if my opponent can fly 1 million UAVs, can I stop that? If that's your primary threat, yeah, the technology is perfectly feasible to do that. It's basically a lot of gun and directed energy systems with a lot of passive sensing and an active sensing layer behind. It means you'd have to re-equip quite a lot of stuff, but it's doable. And the thing is, the Russians are doing it now, because the Russians are facing that as their primary threat now. So yeah, that's the third reason. And coupled to that is the fact that the Ukrainians are frankly better at mass production, mass iteration, rapid iteration, and use of UAVs than NATO forces are going to be in at least the early stages of any conflict with Russian forces, because Ukrainians have 3.5 years of combat experience of doing this. And so they're much better at it than we are going to be. And so if they're losing slowly, and let's be clear, they are at the moment, and it's why we need to not just help them build drones, but we need to get back to really focusing on increasing the amount of artillery they have, increasing the amount of air defense they have, increasing the amount of ATGMs and Stingers and all those other things that we were good at doing, but have kind of, because of the industrial picture and how challenging it is, have perhaps lost some focus on. The Ukrainians need both. If you talk to Ukrainian commanders, they will regularly tell you that for breaking up a Russian attack, they want artillery, they want bonus, particularly, which is a cluster individually seeking submunition anti-tank artillery shell, ATGMs. But for causing attrition across the line, they want FPVs. It's a mix. And the fourth point is just that NATO has better options, thank goodness. If we can gain air superiority, there is nothing in anybody's arsenal that is more efficient and effective than JDAMs, basically. GBU-38 costs the US taxpayer about $18,000 a round for a 500-pound GPS-guided bomb, which, by the way, is relatively resistant to spoofing and jamming because you drop it from pretty much above the target. So the amount of time for it to be sent off course is pretty limited in terms of time of fall, assuming the aircraft knows where it is relative to the target. There's some nuance in there, but jamming equipment also becomes quite vulnerable to air attack if your opponent has mastery of the air. Ultimately, given that we already have, for example, similar aeroplanes, albeit in many cases more capable, similar doctrine to, similar training to, similar tactics to the Israeli Air Force, let's say, who showed exactly what they could do, including with UAS as enablers in some cases, some parts of the operation against the Iranian air defense network recently. We're much closer to being able to, in Europe, have a much more credible deterrent posture through basically fixing our ability to win air superiority through investment in SEAD-DIAD capabilities, in specialization for our air forces, and in connecting them up with the land component to provide ground-based fires and suppressive things like one-way attack UAVs. That is a much easier thing for Europe to get to in the short term from where we currently are, versus this idea that we'll transform our forces and replace essentially artillery and other traditional forms of lethality with loads and loads of UAVs and somehow do it better and at a larger scale and more flexibly than the Ukrainians, which I just don't believe.
So I'm glad you brought up Israel, because I feel like a month and a half ago we had this very conflict play out, right? Iran armed largely with one-way attack drones, the Shaheeds that they were launching in Israel, and Israel with more traditional aircraft, F-35s, 15s, and the like. And it was pretty clear who had the better of that fight over the course of the 12 days that the war progressed. So it seems like your argument was proven in terms of air superiority will beat the one-way attack drone capability for sure. Less on the FPV side, obviously, in that conflict. But nevertheless, I do want to push back a little bit on the physics issue you raised. So certainly from a physics perspective, stopping an FPV drone is easier than stopping a maneuvering ballistic missile. But aren't you forgetting the fact that the cost here matters, right? And when I look at a lot of the anti-UAS solutions that have been developed in the West, many of them have been thwarted. Many of them are quite expensive. There have been attempts at directed energy and all sorts of other things. And if you want to do this cheaply and you're trying to stop a swarm of thousands of these things coming at you, that problem is actually not that easy to solve if you want to have a cost advantage of an interceptor versus a drone itself.
It depends what constraints you place on the systems you're willing to use. So one of the constraints facing a lot of traditional Western counter-UAS systems has been that we developed them, for the most part, to defend things like civilian airports, stadiums, in civilian areas against a primarily assumed to be terrorist UAV threat. And in those contexts, going kinetic is not an option, or at least not an option for most countries. And so for a start, the vast majority of Western dedicated counter-UAS systems in most of the last 10 years have been non-kinetic, i.e. aimed at disrupting the command and control signal, or occasionally going after overloading some bits of the electronic componentry of small UAVs. That's effective if you're facing a commercial off-the-shelf, non-hardened commercial, DJI Mavic, for example. But of course, that's not what predominates on the front lines today in Ukraine, and is not what would predominate in a future conflict. Although it is useful to have those basic capabilities, including the sort of tactical jammers that Ukrainian and Russian vehicles routinely support, which have a pretty short area of effect, but can provide a reasonable layer of protection against terminal homing control. And then you have ways of trying to get around that with autonomous sort of pixel locking, imaging seekers and things. So that there's always this back and forth counterplay, countermeasure. But for example, one very effective way of doing counter UAS is to have a vehicle like a Striker with an acoustic array, so passive, doesn't take much power, very, very simple technology. We used to produce them at scale for the global war on terror for things like sniper location. That will give you a bearing to any small UAV because they have a very distinctive rotor sound. You can reduce it, but then you're using very, very specialized mil-spec silenced rotors, at which point it's a pretty expensive small production scale item, so the cost goes way up, the numbers go way down. But you have an acoustic system, for example, like that mounted on a Striker, plenty of examples of that, or a JLTV. And then you have a 25, 30mm cannon, or even just a 50 cal, but ideally 25 or 30mm minimum, and so that you can have an airburst capability with a decent optical system. Again, most modern turrets have very well stabilized high resolution optics for day and night. And you program that with a bit of machine learning magic to just help it look for contrast on the bearing that the acoustic gives you. Scan that bearing, find it, laser range find, and then just a couple of rounds from the cannon will, generally speaking, do the job. I've seen footage of Bradleys, for example, engaging FPVs in Ukraine, where you're talking 2 or 3 rounds to engage an FPV at significant distances. Those are in specific cases where the optics have been able to pick it out.
Ukraine has Bradleys, it has Strikers. So if it were so easy, why is FPV such a huge threat to the Ukrainians?
Because firstly, the scale. Secondly, the Ukrainians are dealing with what most Europeans are dealing with because it's our equipment. The fact that the vast majority of their equipment is not set up to do that kind of thing. It doesn't have the optics required. It doesn't have the acoustics mounted on the same vehicle. It doesn't have the programming. What I was just describing would be a dedicated counter-UAS modification for an infantry fighting vehicle or an armored fighting vehicle with the aim of deliberately specifying that capability. My point is that all the tech exists. It's just not deployed at scale. So the US has been experimenting with lots of different approaches to this through the MSHORAD programs, Mobile Short-Range Air Defense programs. So there's the directed energy variants, there's the cannon-based variants. There's quite a few ways to go after this problem, all of which require re-equipping quite a significant portion of your vehicles. And you will still have some UAVs get through, always. But the same is true of bullets. You can't stop all bullets. Bullets are going to cause problems. So will artillery shells. You can't stop most things from getting through sometimes. The question is, does it pose a defeat problem to your force? And as I'm sure a US Armored Brigade commander would say, I've heard a couple say similar things to me, if you can get your, let's say, Armored Brigade in the field, that's an if, because long-range strike threats against your logistics, against your assembly points, against your logistics particularly, that's more of a loitering munition problem. That is a medium-range air defense problem, as well as hopefully if you have air superiority, you'll be going after the people transporting these things to the front and launching them and controlling them. So again, the point is offense with air power first. You can't stop all the UAV operatives. But again, an armored brigade commander will say, right, I have 80 Abrams plus a bunch of armored fighting vehicles and a load of really well-trained infantry to move with them, plus some air defense from the MSHORAD program that can knock down some of, not all of the UAVs. So you want to throw a couple of hundred UAVs at me? Sure, you might disable 5, 10 of my Abrams. Doesn't matter. The other 70 will overrun your position and kill you, along with the infantry who screen for them and the AFVs. But that requires a well-trained, fully professional, enabled maneuver force with all of the different sort of component elements. Formations with those kind of capabilities don't exist in the Russian or Ukrainian armed forces and haven't existed since the start of the war, essentially, because the few formations that did have something approaching that level of combined arms capability were used as fire brigades throughout the theatre in the first year of the war and were essentially destroyed on both sides. So what you see in Ukraine is a lot of company scale engagements, so 100-ish infantry with supporting enablers that would be associated from a bigger force. But by definition, they have to be spread out across a very, very sort of distributed line, partly because of the FPV threat and partly because of the artillery threat. And neither side has formations that are capable of running a complex orders process, let alone all of the supporting logistics, to field something like an armored brigade that would actually work as what we would recognize in the West as an armored brigade in the field. And again, I keep going back to the whole air power thing, but it's not just because I'm an air power guy. It's because we built the whole NATO joint force around air superiority because of how unbelievably potent it is when it works, as the Israelis showed. But also, let's not forget 2003, 1991. I mean, when we talk about the Second Iraq War, 2003, people talk constantly about the counterinsurgency and all of the horrific mistakes that we made in 2003 and the legality of it. People don't even really talk about the conventional war. But the Iraqi military was still quite potent in 2003, at least on paper. That was so overwhelming the second time around, and by the way, the first time around. There's a reason why Russia spent as much as it did on air defenses, why China spent as much as it does on air defenses. And by the way, while China, which has the biggest UAV manufacturing industry in the world, bar none, and by the way, almost all Ukrainian UAVs use a lot of Chinese components, and most of ours would as well in Europe, and US efforts to not use Chinese components mean that FPVs cost like $50,000. That's another big problem with relying on UAVs. We don't have an industry to support them at scale. But the Chinese, even they, are building more than 100 fighter jets a year, have 2 to 3 6th-gen crewed fighter platforms in testing, have 2 5th-gen fighter platforms in production, are still cranking out 4th-gen fighter platforms and bombers and AWACS. The idea that we're somehow missing the boat on this stuff. The nations that are best at integrating UAVs, like Israel, fantastic history of using UAVs from the 70s. They are the pioneers of UAVs, essentially, in modern warfare. They're buying loads of F-35s, F-15s, F-16s, ballistic missiles. They see it as a tool to enable the force, not as a replacement for elements of the force, which is what I'm arguing for. It's just to say, yes, we do need uncrewed systems at greater scale than we have in NATO countries, but they should be spec'd and aimed at being procured for and integrated as enablers to get our high-end weapons through to enable our maneuver warfare and air superiority-centric constructs and ways of fighting. Because A, we're quite close to being able to do those, particularly against what the Russian military is now after 3.5 years. And B, we don't really have any other viable options to regenerate that lethality and deterrent capability in Europe in time to head off what the Russian military could threaten us with in just a couple of years. Russian output is pretty scary, even if their ability to tactically employ is very weak. And one of the things we absolutely do need is massive amounts of counter-UAS capability. So while all the technology is there to do it, it's not in place. As I say, probably the finest counter-UAS capabilities in the world as a deployed force are Russian at the moment.
So let me ask one more thing, because there's another sentence in your article that got my attention. I wanted to understand what you're trying to say with that sentence. You say over-reliance on uncrewed aerial systems or drones is leading to significant problems for the armed forces of Ukraine, and is not something the Western military should attempt to replicate. So what are the problems that you think that over-reliance is causing Ukraine? And would you say that if Ukraine had taken the money that they spent on production of these FPV drones and redirected that money to buying artillery or other conventional systems, that money would be better spent?
I have to be slightly careful about talking about operational problems for the Ukrainian armed forces. Obviously, there are operational sensitivities around it. But as stated in the piece, one of the big problems is that now that the Russian military-industrial complex, as well as the Russian armed forces, are increasingly heavily focused on counter-UAS as their core problem set, one of the things they're getting very good at is finding and killing UAV operators in significant numbers. And they're also outproducing the Ukrainians. And the Chinese have built factories to build Chinese UAV components in Russia, while they're trying to clamp down on smuggling efforts to get UAV components to Ukraine. And remember, China says that it doesn't want any of its UAV components or UAVs used in conflict, although they're perfectly happy to supply the Russians. So as Ukraine has been forced to rely more and more heavily on UAVs, it's allowed their adversary to concentrate on just a few problem sets, or in this case one, but with several facets. And the Russian military is very, very good at solving small numbers of problems that it's told to focus on. It's not very good at focusing on a wide set of problems from a bottom-up perspective and actually implementing, but it's very good at solving individual problems that it's given, especially if they're supported by defense industry at the same time, which counter-UAS is being done, particularly through Rubicon at the moment. And secondarily, this is borrowing a phrase from Jack Watling, so I'm shamelessly stealing it, but I will credit him for it. This is Jack's phrase, but the successful performance of warfare, including lots and lots of UAVs, is like an orchestra. You need all the different bits of the orchestra to keep it working. You need the minefields in order to keep the Russians from being able to concentrate and move quickly. You need the artillery to be able to break it up if they do start trying to do that before they can get through the minefields. You need high-end anti-tank to be able to knock out key vehicles quickly if they're concentrating them. And then that enables you to force them into a disposition and a tempo which allows your UAVs to be relatively effective, and means that they have to spread out counter-UAV capabilities across the very long front line, as did the Ukrainians, which gives you more opportunities to find openings all over the front on any given day. If you take away those, or you start running out of those other elements, you start losing the ability potentially to stop the Russians concentrating and using both counter-UAS capabilities and forces in bits of the front where they want, where it can cause some significant issues. Again, it's also, there's a vulnerability for the Ukrainians on the information side of things, because on the one hand, they have to emphasize that they are having successes, and they absolutely are having successes with their incredibly impressive UAV efforts, both industrially and operationally. While at the same time, keeping up the message to their Western suppliers that we don't just need UAVs, we need artillery resupply, we need barrels because we're continuing to go through them. If you ask most Ukrainian commanders, would you prefer more FPVs or more artillery, they will say more tubes and artillery. Because that is what enables them to solve the immediate problem when it occurs, as opposed to cause attrition over time, which is useful, but it doesn't win you the war. The Russians are unfortunately pretty good at absorbing attrition, and you only need to look at the size of the force. If attrition alone was a measure of success against the Russians, they've taken 1.1 million casualties at this point, killed, wounded, missing, captured. But the force has gone from about 200,000 in February 2022, committed against Ukraine, to about 600,000 now. So just on that measure alone, it's not working. But just on the last question that you asked, if the Ukrainians had put the money towards more production of artillery, etc., I don't think they had that option. This is not an article attempting to blame Ukraine for the way they've gone. It really isn't. Because one of the notable facets of a UAV manufacturing complex, for want of a better term, within their economy, is it can be really dispersed. Because you don't need big metalworking facilities, barrel foundries, all of that stuff. So the onus really should be on Ukraine's partners and allies to be providing them with the stuff that, if Ukraine concentrated on producing domestically at a greater scale than it is, would probably just get missiles through the roof. Once you're in contact, especially given how many long-range strike options the Russians have, and remember, the most damage is not even being caused by the huge numbers of Shaheds or Garans, although that is a significant problem. The real damage is still mostly being caused by the ballistic missiles and the cruise missiles. It's just that the huge volume of Shaheds and Garans is making it more and more difficult to sustain the defense against those cruise and ballistic missiles. And of course, they do cause casualties and problems in and of themselves. It's just some targets you can't really deal with effectively with a 40 or 50 kilogram warhead.
Yeah. Let's talk about a few other things. So I understand the premise of the argument that replacement is not a smart idea. You were mostly talking about European militaries. Does this apply to the U.S. as well, or do you think that the U.S. has the resources to do both, right? Invest in conventional capabilities as we're doing, but also equip the force with FPVs and other uncrewed systems?
You see, on paper, the U.S. has the resources to do both, but in practice, the U.S. already faces so many incredibly difficult competing modernization and force maintenance tasks and resource drains, particularly in the air domain, which has been frankly grotesquely underfunded given how much America depends on air superiority over the last 25 years, thanks to the global war on terror. If you look at what the choices that are facing, for example, the US Air Force, in terms of trying to keep its fleets going as they continue to age out, procure 5th gen, next gen for F-47, new ICBMs, new silos, new tankers, new bombers. There's just too much stuff, given how expensive the force is to maintain, especially given that every time they try to retire something in order to create space, like the A-10, Congress tells them they can't, which is kind of insane from an outside perspective. It's like the US Army trying to stop buying Abrams, which they did several times over the past few years, and being told they were not allowed to stop buying Abrams. So I think on paper, the US has the resource to do both. If it was me, given how good the US is at the traditional combined arms joint force maneuver warfare, better than any other country on earth by a country mile, especially given the ability that the US has to enable it and project it, I would be focusing what capacity I could generate by cutting other things, and remember, it's still by cutting other things, in terms of people as well as money and industrial capacity, on the counter UAS rather than the building lots of small UAS bit. Frankly, in terms of firepower, the US has plenty of options to annihilate anybody in the field that they can get a superiority over. And its other big challenge in the Indo-Pacific is anti-ship and protecting its own ships, and small UAVs don't really help you there. Uncrewed underwater vehicles, really interesting, although for some of the anti-ship as opposed to ISR, you're essentially talking about smart torpedoes. Let's be honest, modern torpedoes are uncrewed underwater vehicles.
You're talking about extended range and modular systems that can have various payloads. So a lot of interesting.
Yeah, like XL UUVs that can do some interesting stuff. Look, one of the most underserved and underappreciated aspects of any successful air campaign is the ability to put decoys and stand-in jammers in significant numbers into adversary air defenses. Now, the Israelis not only have F-35, F-15, and F-16, and interestingly, high-end destruction of air defenses effectors, which is the thing we don't have glaringly in Europe. They have ROX, Rampage, both air-launched ballistics, and then Delilah and some others in terms of non-ballistic. But they also have lots of loitering munitions options. And again, loitering munitions are not new. And cyber, yeah, sure. Cyber, the problem with cyber is it takes you a long time to in place. You have to do it in an adversary's defense system short of war. So that's an intelligence services thing, not a military thing, because militaries can't screw with other militaries short of war, at least not legally. And then you don't know it's going to work. You have to have redundancy in your plan. But yeah, I mean, cyber's obviously key, and increasingly EW, including from space, which is another interesting area. But the uncrewed loitering systems, a lot of things people talk about in terms of collaborative combat aircraft, or ACPs, or whatever you want to call them, loyal wingmen, they're essentially talking about smart decoys, i.e. things that can go in ahead of the package and can look like an enemy plane if they want to, radar cross-section wise, can do some stand-in jamming. Those sort of things have existed for a very long time. The US has something called the ADM-160, for example, the MALD, miniaturized air-launched decoys. But the latest version, the MALD-X, for example, does really cool RCS mimicry, but also does some stand-in jamming, and you can launch lots of them from a single pylon of most aircraft that carry it. That fits actually most definitions you see of low-end ACPs or CCAs. The same with the Israeli Harop or Harpy, like they're ground-launched, but they're launching munitions. They go in and they can look for targets either with an anti-radiation seeker or with a human in the loop with some automated modes. Like, this stuff isn't new. It's just that most people have only discovered it recently and have projected AI and small drones kind of on top of those concepts in their heads. A lot of it you don't need AI for, and a lot of it is basically propeller-powered cruise missiles that do smart things. But those sorts of things would be hugely important for the US in any counter-China scenario, and Europe in any counter-Russia scenario, because saturating air defenses with decoys and stand-in jammers and things is really important and really useful and is a huge force multiplier. But it's not a replacement for your high-end CID munitions. It's what helps get them through. Same with the Ukrainians taking out SA-21, so S-400s with periodically with ATACMS strikes. ATACMS is a pretty high-end weapon, even though it's old, and there's quite a lot of enablement that goes into helping that happen.
Let me ask a related question to that, because obviously pre this war, Russia was considered to have some of the best air defense capabilities in the world, some of the most advanced, like the S-400s. Where do you think they stand now, 3.5 years in, with a lot of those systems destroyed? Do you think they're much less potent force in terms of being able to prevent NATO from establishing air superiority in a conflict?
I wouldn't say they're significantly less potent. They have less tolerance for attrition against their high-end air defenses because they've lost quite a few of them. But on the other hand, they've continued to produce them and expanded the production. The coverage is still pretty impressive and overlaying, and interlayered. The attrition is significant, but it certainly doesn't mean NATO's job is done by any means. It does mean they have less ability to replace losses, but they are significantly better than they used to be, in that they're a lot more experienced at shooting down munitions. They're a lot better at interacting with their air counterparts, both AWACS and fighters. They're better at shoot and scoot. They're better at integrating their short range, medium range, and long range things. Their crews have had a lot more experience, and their EW, both the deconfliction with their EW and their interactions with EW, are much more capable than they were. So to be honest, I'd say if anything, they're slightly better than they were. The flip side is we understand them in Europe at a far more granular level than we did before because of all the data we've got out of Ukraine on how their systems work and how they're employed. Yeah, I'd say we're probably in a slightly stronger position in Europe than we were 3.5 years ago if we had to go after Russian air defenses at scale now, but only slightly. And we could, with not an enormous amount of investment, albeit it needs to be done yesterday, in CID munitions and uncrewed sort of chaff to essentially soak up capacity while we do the CAMEOs, to composite air operations, to start breaking in. We could get to a position where we're in a much stronger position than we were 3.5 years ago, relatively quickly if we prioritize it.
And what's your view on Operation Spiderweb and what the Israelis had done in Iran with these forward deployed drones that target air defenses? A lot of people have said at the time, this is a game changer. Do you think that something like this capability can be utilized again in a conflict, can be scaled to neutralize air defenses?
Well, I mean, it's not a game changer in the sense that it's been around as a threat and a possibility for a very long time. It's certainly impressive, although one probably shouldn't overstate the physical aspect of the damage. Ultimately, we're looking at 6 to 7 Tu-95s and 4 or 5 Tu-22s.
Right. That was in the Ukrainian case, but in the Israeli case, my understanding is that it was quite significant in terms of the impact to Iranian air defenses.
Sure, but I wouldn't say it was necessary in the sense that we already saw them take out 6 or so of the highest end target acquisition and fire control radars in the Iranian air defense network without those tools last October, which in many ways is why they were able to establish air superiority so quickly this time in Rising Lion. So yes, useful and interesting, and definitely something that you would expect to see in a counter A2AD campaign in future. On both sides. Something that we absolutely need to be more aware of in terms of Western air forces, particularly from a force protection point of view, because this has been a known threat for a long time. It's just that we've seen it, employed in the open, as it were. But again, it's not a threat to which there aren't answers. If you're willing to use them, there's some interesting things you can do with directed energy in terms of high-powered microwave systems. They have some interesting effects in terms of collateral in that line of fire if you fire them at low aspect angles in populated areas. It start to mess up people's cars and phones and things. But in certain air bases, that might not be a problem, or you might judge that's worth it. There's quite a lot you could do with cannons with airburst ammunition that's self-destroying, like the old CRAM systems with S-band radars, because, of course, unlike in the front lines in Ukraine, on an airbase, you don't necessarily care about MCON in terms of missions control, because you're not trying to hide from an adversary at an airbase. So you can have a AESA, active electronically scanned, or a 360-degree counter-UAS radar that will detect things pretty quickly. Could, for example, you could buy 35mm cannons, for example, from Elecon with airburst ammunition to take out significant numbers of small threats. In extremis, even 12 bores with tungsten buckshot is not a terrible plan for some people to have as a last line of defense. But one of the biggest things is just build hardened aircraft shelters. No small UAV is getting through a hardened aircraft shelter. Yes, if your opponent can fly tactical fighters above your hardened aircraft shelters and plink them with paveway 3s, then yes, they're not a particularly good use of money, but nobody's going to be able to do that to NATO forces. Ultimately, hardened aircraft shelters, refurbing the ones we have and building new ones, which also is just money back into the local economy because you can hire your local highways agency contractors to do it. It's just concrete and steel, like it's not difficult technology. That's a huge part of the answer to that problem. And you see the Russians already doing it. In a lot of the air bases relatively close to Ukraine, they are building lots of hardened aircraft shelters, or have already built lots of hardened aircraft shelters, which also, by the way, provides defense against most one-way attack systems, because most one-way attack UAVs like Shaheds or Garans even don't have a big enough warhead to get through a hardened aircraft shelter. So yeah, there's quite a bit you could do in terms of base hardening and active defenses, more than we do, and it absolutely should be a priority for Western air forces. And, of course, counter-UAS Western ground forces. The flip side, though, is that for the sort of things that we saw in SpiderWeb, and remember, this took the Ukrainians a year and a half of meticulous, very high-priority planning and execution to do at quite high risk. It wasn't easy, and great credit to them for the way they pulled it off. But your first line of defense against these sort of threats has to be the intelligence services and the police, not the military. In the same way, and I probably overuse this analogy, but your defense against suicide bombers should not primarily be guys with guns on checkpoints. That is a terrible defense against that kind of threat. In some cases, you might want that as a last resort, in the same way as you might want hard kill defenses, and you should probably have some hard kill defenses for counter-UAS and cruise missiles and things at your air bases. But ultimately, for the defense against someone bringing a shipping container full of plastic explosive equipped small UAVs with automated programming near your airbase and setting them off within a couple of clicks, you have to be tracking the networks that are smuggling this stuff into your country or assembling it in country. It's not easy to get lots of plastic explosive. So people are either self-radicalizing, or these are GRU, Fifth Directorate of the FSB, whatever, groups that our intelligence services should be tracking, and generally speaking are. But it does require political permissions to move quickly against those sorts of threats, and also coordination with local police. For example, in the UK, and I don't know what it is in most countries, but the RAF police and the RAF regiment, who are charged with protecting air bases, are not allowed to go and arrest people, 10 miles away from, or 10 kilometers away from an airbase because they think they have UAVs. Their jurisdiction doesn't extend beyond the base. So, once those threats come into the base, they might be legally perhaps allowed to go and try and find those people, but it's too late then. So you have to have good relations with your local constabulary power equipped forces as well, whether be they counter-terror police or local police. The military is simply not equipped or established or legally allowed to employ the sort of techniques and intelligence gathering networks, etc., to really go after that kind of threat. It has to be the intelligence services first and foremost.
All right, let me ask the last question, because I'd be remiss not to ask you this. We've had you on many times in the past to discuss the F-16 issue, right? And it's now been a year since the F-16s have been announced to have been delivered to Ukraine. Your assessment on how they've been used. You've had a lot of concerns over the years about the Ukrainians being able to utilize them effectively. They require pristine runways. They seem to be using them in the air defense mission. How do you think it's gone?
In terms of their basing posture and the way that they've been able to move them around and operate, very impressive. As discussed before, this is not an easy aeroplane to do that with. And the fact that so far they haven't, touch wood, lost any on the ground, they haven't been hit on the ground, and they've been able to continue operating and expand the fleet is a huge testament to both the Ukrainians and all the partner forces who've been involved in helping them. That's fantastic. Really, really encouraging to see. In terms of the effectiveness, I think they've helped a bit in terms of internal air defense. Been shooting down cruise missiles and some Iran Shaheds. They've had some losses, and they've been helping to deliver glide bombs and things, mostly glide bombs, alongside the MiG-29 and Sukhoi 27 and Sukhoi 25 fleets. So, in some ways encouraging, in other ways, in terms of output, operational output, quite an expensive way to achieve what's been achieved. But it provides a long-term basis for the Ukrainian fighter force to continue to exist. They've gained a lot of valuable operational data in terms of how to overcome all those F-16 specific challenges of survivably operating and maintaining the jets in country. So now, as the additional cadres of pilots who've been trained from scratch in the West start coming in to Ukraine with additional aircraft, there's a good basis to plan on, or to expand the force on. And the French supplied Mirage 2000 crews seem to have also done some really good work in terms of shooting down cruise missiles and Shaheds. It is noticeable that a couple of the losses have been people shooting down Shaheds with the gun. It's not a good idea. The US Air Force operational analysis on this is pretty clear. You have to get too close to get a decent sight picture through the Pipper of such a small target. And because of the speed discrepancy, there's just a really high risk if you engage Shaheds with the gun on a fighter that you get hit by the debris as it explodes.
Do you almost have to get behind it instead of trying to...
Well, it's not so much... Well, I mean, you could attack it from various aspects. It depends on the altitude it's at and where you're coming from. But it's more just that it's really small relative to a fighter. And especially if it's at night. Like, to aim a gun properly in a fighter, you need to have a sight picture of the target in your Pipper.
But the U.S. did it successfully against the Shahed attacks from Iran on Israel over the course of last year, right?
In one or two cases, as I understand it, one can read quite a lot into the fact that the US has put so much emphasis on very rapidly developing and fielding loadouts with what they call, I think, the AGR-20, what the manufacturer would call the APKWS-2, so the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System 2, snappy title. Basically, laser-guided rockets. The gun is not seen as an efficient or safe way of dealing with Shaheds. You just have to get too close. Different for helicopters or light aircraft, because where you have a much lower speed difference, you can be in that zone where you are for longer, where you have a decent chance of hitting the thing without the danger so much of flying through the debris if it goes off. But yes, whereas of course the problem with not using the gun is that if you don't have APKWS-2, then Sidewinders and Magics are very expensive ways of shooting down Garans. Whereas if you're using them to engage KH-101s, S-23, Kodiak, cruise missiles, that's a much more even exchange.
Makes sense. Well, Justin, you never disappoint for a very deep intellectual discussion on all aspects of air power and modern warfare. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.